And one of the reasons why the regulation so far is ignored by countries and corporates is most probably the fact that the communication around EMIR was terrible. So if you look at the body of ESMA, who is responsible, so to speak, for the implementation of EMIR, I just checked yesterday. This is maybe some new information for people not knowing how many people work for ESMA. They employ in total 154 people, of which 118 are temporary agents and 10 are senior management. So if you look at the fact that they are also responsible for the entire banking and finance industry, so to speak, then you can imagine that they didn't have the respective resources for a proper implementation of that. The same applies for the NCAs. In Austria, where I come from, for example, we have 1.5 person at the national competent authorities being responsible for EMIR. So you better not call them because they won't give you any answer anyway. The same to some extent applied for repositories, but this is not a big surprise since the repositories, the trade repositories, have been appointed just 90 days before the reporting obligation came into force. So until that time, nobody could know whether they will be accepted as repository or not. Another disturbing factor are social media. If you look, for example, at discussions in LinkedIn, then you will be surprised what you read there. Another aspect being responsible for the misinformation are to some extent banks, also auditors. For example, from Denmark, we heard that banks told Danish corporates, forget about EMIR, it doesn't affect you because you just have forward contracts. I will come to that later because that's one of the next critical aspects. Also, system providers obviously underestimated the effort that was necessary to become compliant with, for example, the reporting obligation. So from a corporate point of view, we just speak about two main obligations. That's the so-called risk mitigation and the reporting. If you are an NFC minus, a non-financial counterparty, then you can forget about everything which is related to clearing, etc. So this is one of the few cases where a minus is a positive sign. Coming back to risk mitigation, what does it mean? First of all, you have to make sure that your transactions are timely confirmed, which today means T+2 at the latest. You have to make sure that you, from time to time, depending on the number of trades that you have, will try to compress your portfolios. So, for example, if you have more than 500 transactions with just one counterparty, as an NFC minus, you at least have to try twice a year to compress your portfolio, which simply means replace a larger number of transactions by maybe just one transaction. The reason why corporates quite often have a lot of transactions is simply based on the fact that due to IFRS requirements, they have to break down their hedging transactions into single transactions. So the good thing with the compression itself is, as long as you can document the reason why you do not compress, you're fine and you're compliant. And another point is that you have to reconcile your portfolios. This is something you don't necessarily need EMIR for, because normally you should do that anyway. So here are the numbers. If you have more than 100 transactions with one counterparty, with a single counterparty, then it is a quarterly objective, a quarterly task that you reconcile your positions with the respective counterparties. If you have fewer than 100, then it's just an annual task. Please bear in mind, this applies this applies for internal trades as well as for external trades. There were, at the beginning especially, rumors that internal trades are not covered by EMIR. This is not the fact. If somebody had read the law, then it would have been easily identified. There are a couple of myths that I would like to dispel. For example, clearing. One of the most discussed things at the beginning was how to comply with clearing. So for NFC miners, clearing is not an issue at all, even though banks or system providers said something else. This is also one of the things we were a little bit worried about, that we saw comments also from treasury associations just saying beware of clearing. For 99.99% of the European corporates, clearing is not an issue. I personally know just one corporate that is an NFC plus, falling under the clearing obligation. That's a huge oil company. Another myth is the reporting of market values. We just recently received a red note, so to speak, from one of the auditors of our clients, complaining about the fact that this client, which is a mid-sized German corporate, has not reported market values. So the problem that we see here is that for the time being, we seem to be confronted with a large education program for auditors, because they haven't read the law, they haven't read ESMA's Q&A documents, etc. One of the issues there is also that to some extent all market participants are somehow lost in translation, because when I mentioned before, ESMA has 154 employees. They come from 24 different nations. Doesn't mean that they don't speak proper English, but if you look at the Q&A documents, for example, we would have written it in a different way so that participants could have understood. One of the issues that we have been fighting with recently, and I think this fight will go on until 2017 at least, is the fact that EMIR, as a regulation which comes into force immediately in all member countries, refers to MiFID, a directive which has to be transferred into national law. So EMIR simply says derivatives are listed in the attachment to MiFID, which is definitely the case. It's also definitely the case that forward contracts, for example, are listed as derivative instruments, regardless the asset class. So I had the pleasure of holding a training for EuroFinance last November when I spoke about forward contracts falling under the reporting obligation, and then somebody came to me and said, in UK this doesn't apply. Because here in UK, if we have a forward contract with a UK-based bank, then we don't have to report it. What is that? And so we eventually found out that there is a recommendation which doesn't have any legal implications, not to report forward contracts between UK counterparties. But if a UK corporate has a trade with, for example, a German bank, then the recommendation is report it. If you have a forward contract with your subsidiary in Singapore, the recommendation is report it. So it doesn't make the life of the corporate treasurers easier to say, let's exempt UK internal trades. However, this is a big problem at the moment, because since the UK has a different interpretation of the derivative definition, Luxembourg says, okay, let's wait what the UK will do. Denmark says, we don't care at the moment. This is not good, because EMIR is a law. It's a nightmare on top of that, of course, due to the fact that it has been introduced so badly. But on the other hand, it's there. So I always call it a gravity issue. You can be against it, but it doesn't change anything. So corporates, as well as other market participants, of course, have to be compliant. And if a Treasury association, for example, says we recommend ignoring the law, then they are also responsible for the fact that corporates in the respective countries are not compliant with the law, and sooner or later facing fines which will be introduced and executed on top of that. So this is one of the biggest issues, and not because I'm, so to speak, from the EMIR industry, but my recommendation definitely is try to be as compliant as possible, and you will not expect any issues with your auditors or with the authorities. With regards to the reporting, the transaction reporting, one comment. It seems to be quite tempting to delegate the reporting obligation to your counterparties, to your banks. The situation that we are currently facing is that I would say most of the banks are not able to provide their clients with information when a trade has been reported, to which repository, and what the current status of the trade is, especially with regards to the reconciliation of the trade. So this is a tricky part, because if they don't provide you with the information that you need in order to be able to prove that you are compliant, you are not compliant. So we see a lot of corporates complaining about the fact that they haven't received any information from their banks, and we don't see in the near future that this will change, because that would mean a probably quite high investment on the infrastructure side of the bank's IT systems. They are not prepared for that. So the only thing that they are doing is they send something to a repository. But the critical aspect with the whole EMIR reporting is that you have to be able to interpret and understand what is the content of the message that you receive in return, because that contains valuable information. For example, what is the reconciliation status of your trades? And if you don't check that, you are not compliant. So we see a lot of auditors, of course, running around with reports and saying, okay, here are unreconciled trades, what's the reason? And everybody says, I don't know. So you could know, because the repositories should prepare a registrar calls it a mismatch report, where you should be able to see on a field-by-field basis why a trade has not been reconciled. One of the nasty things that we see today is that even though there were recommendations how, for example, to report an FX swap or an FX forward trade, the banks simply ignore these recommendations and report something. So we have seen, for example, the client reports an FX forward, the bank reports an option. We don't know why. If you ask the bank, they say, we don't know, it's the system. So it's a long way to Tipperary. Why did I mention 2017 before? MiFID II is expected to come into force in January 2017. So all the market participants hope and pray that MiFID II will sort out all problems with regards to the definition of instruments. However, for the time being, the only thing that repositories validate when you send something to the repository is whether you have provided a legal entity identifier, which is okay, so to speak, and whether you have provided UTI, the so-called unique trade ID. But everything else, they cannot check, because there is no European-wide definition which fields have to be informed when you report an interest swap, for example. So, as you can imagine, the whole reconciliation, even at trade repository level, but on top, between the repositories, is an entire mess. So we heard about numbers of 1% of trades globally or within the European Union is reconciled, and I don't even believe that this is the case. So this will be a very long way. If you decide to report on your own behalf, so to speak, or directly to a repository, the only constant factor during the first months was change. in specifications, in definitions, how to construct an XML message, etc. So doing it alone, on your own, is maybe at first glance, so to speak, cheaper than using any external services, but the fun factor is definitely below zero. Since we still expect modifications not to the regulations, but to the reporting requirements, I would strongly recommend considering also other options than reporting yourself. You also have to be aware of the fact that each modification to a trade has to be reported. This is something a lot of corporates are not aware of. So if you, for example, have an amortizing swap, then you, of course, also have to report the changing notional, for example. Regarding the reporting itself, we expect this to clarify not by the end of the year, but this will probably take another year. So we have seen the first, what ESMA calls, and this sounds a little bit dangerous, it's the level 1 validation. So 1 implies that there could be a level 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 as well. This is the first step, and it's a reasonable step in order to streamline, so to speak, the structure of the trade reports to the repository. But I personally do not think that this is the end of the road. Coming back to the initial headline of this short session, I would say the radar boxes are already installed, so you should not wait until the authorities start applying fines, because the fines catalogs already have been defined. They just need to be put into force. So if you're not compliant with the EMIR regulation, then you have to be aware of the fact that sooner or later the authorities could come and confront you with fines. Should you require any further details regarding the regulation itself, I had a presentation yesterday, and it will be made available as a handout. So that's the reason why I didn't continue with the PowerPoint karaoke session here. Please feel free to download it as soon as these presentations are made available to the delegates. Should you have any further questions, I'll be around here for the next 15 minutes. And thank you for your attention.